Esme Anne Platt was born in 1895 on a small farm on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. Since she was a child, she had always felt that her world was too small, that her life was already set on a path she could not change. But she accepted it. She knew nothing else. She was the only daughter of a family of farmers, simple and hardworking people who expected from her the same as any other young woman her age: to learn how to run a household, to become a respectable wife, to have children, and raise them with the same discipline with which she had been raised. But Esme had different dreams. She loved learning. Her elementary school teacher had encouraged her to continue studying, but her father did not see it as necessary. A woman did not need more education than what was required to manage a home. Still, Esme was happy. She found joy in the small moments, running through open fields, climbing trees with the village boys, imagining that one day she would travel far away, that she would see the world. But childhood dreams do not take long to fade when reality catches up with them. When she was 16, she fell while climbing a tree. She broke her leg, and her family took her to the small local medical office. It was there that she met Dr. Carlisle Cullen for the first time. He was different from any other adult she had ever met. There was something about him that intrigued her, not just his kindness, but the sadness in his gaze. Though they barely spoke during the consultation, Esme never forgot his golden eyes. But dreams and memories could not change her fate. At 22, her father decided it was time for her to marry. Her husband, Charles Evenson, was a respected man in the community. He came from a good family, had a stable job, and represented everything a woman should desire in a husband. But behind closed doors, the truth was very different. The first time Charles raised his hand against her, Esme did not believe it. She told herself it had been an accident, that perhaps she had provoked him, that it should not happen again. The second time, she understood it was no mistake. The marks on her skin became harder to hide. Her smiles in church every Sunday were more forced. The nights became a routine of silence and fear, waiting for Charles to return from work without the anger in his eyes. But the worst part was not the pain, it was the loneliness. In her world, a married woman had to endure her husband without complaint. There was no one to turn to, no place to escape, until one day she discovered she was pregnant. For the first time in years, she felt hope. The baby would change everything. If she had a child, Charles would be different. Maybe, just maybe, she would find a purpose beyond suffering. But fate did not grant her that hope. At 8 months pregnant, she received one final beating. This time, it was too much. Days later, she lost her child, and with him, she lost any reason to keep living. She did not wait any longer. She ran away. She traveled as far as she could, with no plan, no money, no direction. But the absence of her child weighed on her chest like a stone too heavy to bear. And so, on a dark night, she decided she could not go on. She walked to a cliff. She stood there, staring at the vast emptiness, the roar of the water crashing against the rocks below. She closed her eyes and let herself fall. She felt the air whip against her skin, the cold licking her body. She felt the freedom of knowing that, for the first time in her life, she had chosen something for herself. But death did not come as she expected. When she woke up, she was no longer human. And Carlisle Cullen was there, the same sadness in his eyes, the same voice that, years ago, had spoken to her kindly when she was just a girl with an unbroken soul. Esme felt the burning in her throat, the inhuman hunger consuming her from within. But the only thing she could wonder was why he had saved her. Esme woke up with a gasp, her body rigid, her senses overwhelmed by a torrent of stimuli she had never experienced before. Everything around her was clearer, more intense. The sound of the wind against the window, the creaking of the wooden house, even the heartbeats of animals in the distant forest. But what she felt the most was hunger. It was a burning fire in her throat, a primal need that forced her to move before she could even think about it. She sat up with a speed she hadn't expected, and in the blink of an eye, Carlisle was beside her, his hands raised, his expression serene but watchful. "Esme," his voice was low, gentle, as if speaking to a frightened animal. "Breathe." Esme trembled. Her gaze settled on him, and for the first time, she noticed what she had previously ignored. His skin was too pale, too perfect. His golden eyes watched her with a patience that felt strange. "What?" "What did you do to me?" she asked, but deep down she already knew the answer. Carlisle tilted his head slightly, the sadness in his eyes deepening. "I saved you." Esme felt her body tense. "You didn't want to be saved, did you?" he whispered, a faint melancholy in his tone. She shook her head, feeling a lump in her throat that would never again produce tears. "I wanted to die." Carlisle sighed and lowered his gaze. "I know." There was a silence between them, the sense that something invisible stretched between them, something neither was ready to face. But Esme couldn't remain in the darkness. "Why did you do it?" Carlisle looked at her with an intensity that made her shiver. "Because I couldn't let you go." The first few months were a test of endurance. Carlisle taught her to hunt animals instead of humans. He explained the rules of their existence, how she had to control her thirst, the need to remain hidden. But beyond discipline and self-control, Esme began to notice other things. Carlisle never spoke of his past, at least not in depth. He always diverted the conversation when she asked about his history, about what had led him to become what he was. And the strangest thing of all, he seemed to know her too well. At first, she thought it was coincidence. But as weeks and months passed, she realized that Carlisle knew things about her that he couldn't have learned in such a short time. Small things. The way she loved the sound of rain against the window, the way she always crossed her arms when thinking, childhood memories he mentioned without her ever telling him. The feeling that he had been watching her long before meeting her grew inside her. And then, one night, she found the journals. She discovered them on an old bookshelf in Carlisle's study. Worn leather books, covered in dust. When she opened the first one, her body froze completely. Every page was filled with detailed notes, dates, locations, descriptions of events of her life. Carlisle had been writing about her for years, since her childhood in Columbus, since he met her when she was 16 after her fall from the tree, since before she married Charles Evenson, since before she lost her child, since before she tried to take her own life. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages. Carlisle knew what was going to happen to her. He knew that her life with Charles would be a prison. He knew she would lose her child. He knew that, in her desperation, she would throw herself from that cliff. "Why didn't you stop me?" The air inside her, though unnecessary, felt heavy. Carlisle had never tried to save her before. He had waited until she had no choice, waited until she was his. The door creaked behind her. Esme turned sharply. Carlisle stood at the entrance of the room. He didn't seem surprised that she had found the journals. His expression was unreadable, but it wasn't surprise on his face. It was resignation. "I knew you'd find it sooner or later." Esme felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "Why?" Carlisle didn't answer immediately. He walked slowly to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "Because I always knew you'd be part of my family." Esme felt a chill. "Your family?" Carlisle turned his head and looked at her calmly. "Edward will arrive soon." Esme frowned. "Edward the first," Carlisle whispered. "The son I never had." Something in his tone chilled her to the bone. "And what am I?" Carlisle smiled with an unsettling tenderness. "You are my wife." The world stopped. Esme took a step back. "Since when?" Carlisle stepped toward her. "Since always." His voice was soft, as if he were telling her that everything would be all right. But Esme felt no peace. She felt nothing. She only understood the truth. Carlisle hadn't just saved her. He had waited long enough so she couldn't escape. And now she was eternal. Eternal and his.